I'm your host, Melinda Briana Epler, the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. This series goes deep and gets real. We're building empathy for underrepresented and historically marginalized people and providing tangible, actionable steps we can all take to be better allies and better advocates for each other. On screen, we have Jasmine. She's an ASL interpreter, sponsored by Interpreter Now, which is a deaf-owned company. Today, we're discussing living and leading through fear, bias, and othering with my friend and colleague, Ritu Bhasin, speaker, author, and consultant at Bhasin Consulting. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Yeah. This is an important topic, particularly given where we are right now. And I think it kind of builds upon episode 8, where we talked with Michael Thomas about intergenerational trauma and how we all experience that, and racial trauma, and many of us experience trauma throughout our lives. And I think this is building upon that and the conversation we had there. So could you start by telling us a bit about your story, who you are, and what led you to this moment where you're doing the work that you're doing now? What was your aha moment? How did you get there?
So many moments. My name is Ritu Bhasin, she, her, hers. I was born of Indian immigrant parents. And so I'm Canadian. I live in Toronto, Canada. And on a good day, you can't really see the CN Tower is right there, the symbol for my great city. My parents immigrated to Toronto almost 50 years ago now. I'm 45 or will be very shortly, and was born here with my siblings. And we're Punjabi by culture from India, and we're Sikh by faith. And when I say Sikh, my religion is called Sikhism. I am a Sikh. It's spelled S-I-K-H, pronounced Sikh, not Sikh. My father wears a turban, which is a clear distinguisher of my faith. From a very young age, I learned about racism. I learned about racism firsthand because my parents would come home and talk about their own experiences. I had my own experiences growing up in Toronto, and amongst my peer group, I grew up primarily around white kids, and had experienced relentless childhood bullying tied back to racism. When I was 8 years old in 1984, my people, the Sikh community in India, experienced genocide, state sanctioned. And back then, no internet really, and no broadcasting, and not as much concern or care about genocide or broadcasting it globally. And so it was not very known at the time, but I knew it and I felt it in my body. And then in addition, my parents would talk about their own experiences, not a lot, but they touched on it, with being born into war and exile as India decolonized back in the 1940s. My mother's family, for example, literally exiled when she was born out of now Pakistan, then India, to Delhi, India. So growing up, I had an upbringing that was really centered and entrenched in awareness of racism and white supremacy. We didn't call it that then, but I was aware of it, and I felt it, and it lived in my body. I committed at a young age to finding my own voice, but helping others to do the same, because I just felt so powerless and disempowered for so much of my upbringing. I felt disconnected from my identity. I felt so lost. On some days, I was like, what does it mean to be Canadian when I'm brown skinned growing up in white Canadiana? And then other days I felt like a total social misfit and disconnected. I didn't experience belonging among my other South Asian Canadian peers, because my parents had taught me as well to learn how to shift cultural codes. So to embody whiteness based on their own experiences of colonization. And I had learned to do that. And so I felt lost a lot, really struggled with my identity. I decided ultimately that I was going to do social justice work in some capacity. I decided to become a lawyer, and found myself in the towers, corporate towers, which you can see back there. I literally worked in those towers. And I did that for a few years, felt completely disconnected from the legal profession, transitioned to doing HR. So I became an HR executive for many years. And in the context of that, I focused quite a bit on diversity, inclusion, equity within my firm and within the legal community. And then it was like, I felt my stride. I felt the fire lit. I realized that I wanted to commit my life to doing equity, diversity, inclusion work for a living. So it's now 10 years ago that I started my consulting practice, and I've dedicated my life to this. I run a consulting firm out of Toronto, Canada. The bulk of my work is outside of Canada, though I work a lot in the US and globally, in helping to build more empowered and inclusive workplaces and a society as a whole. And I do this for myself so that I can heal and I can experience belonging, so that I can teach others about how to do this and make this happen, and so that we can collectively experience authenticity and belonging.
Thank you for sharing your story. Appreciate that. And you also wrote a book.
Oh, yes, I did. I did. You know, it's so funny, Melinda, when I sometimes, I don't know if this happens to others, like I forget that I wrote a book. Like I would forget until you mentioned you wrote that. And then when I look at it, I'm like, hell's yes, I wrote that book. It's like giving birth, a true labor of love.
I'm starting to understand that myself.
I knew you would.
So can you, okay, so let's dive in into the topic. How does fear play a role in bias and othering? You know, you and I kind of talked about this topic together, and this was something that you're really thinking about a lot and passionate about right now. What is the relationship between fear, bias, and othering?
Yeah. So fear really is everything as it relates to bias. So our bodies are regulated by our nervous systems, and one of our body's primary functions, the nervous system's primary function, is to keep us safe from harmful stimuli in the environment. And so the body either feels safe or it doesn't. When it doesn't feel safe, it will do whatever it needs in order to bring itself into safety, which includes avoid danger, avoid threat stimuli in the environment that might cause me harm. And so that essentially is what bias is all about. It's this might harm me, and so I should avoid it. Whereas this feels safe and familiar to me, so I can and should gravitate towards it. This is essentially what bias is about. And so these decisions around avoid harm, avoid threat stimuli, and gravitate towards things that make me feel safe and secure. Yes, this is a conscious decision-making process, but it's largely done unconsciously. We don't even realize we're doing it. And so fear is everything as it relates to bias, gravitate to or push away from difference or what feels unsafe, and gravitate towards sameness. And this, by the way, by extension, is what othering is all about. Othering is, you are in my out group because my body is telling me you might be unsafe, whereas you are in my in group. And that's what othering is really about. And so fear cascades into bias, and bias cascades into othering.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that play out in real time right now in the world, particularly the US, but I think, you know, there's a lot going on in the world right now related to seeing police brutality and police murder of Black people. Also, I think it's important to think about this in terms of COVID as well, and how you know, when we're you know, when we're in our homes, what does that do to how we think about each other? Maybe do you want to talk a little bit about that? How is this this context and the space that we're living in right now, this world that we're living in right now, affected and affecting fear, affecting othering?
Like this moment, it's like sometimes I feel like I'm on another planet. I'm on planet COVID, and I'm like, is this really happening? Actually, yes, it is really happening. The there are so many aspects, nuanced, complicated aspects of this moment around COVID that for me feel really problematic as it relates to bias, to fear, to bias, and to othering, because I worry that we have like the perfect mix that will cause the proliferation of bias and how we people, other people, especially people who are not like us and who are vilified in society. And so, first of all, in this moment, the COVID environment that we find ourselves in, there is actually a genuine, like a real warranted fear of contracting a virus that is invisible. We cannot see it. We do not know definitively who carries it. We it can be anywhere, like literally can be anywhere. And because of that, a lot of us are experiencing heightened activation. And in fact, let me tell you a quick story. The genesis of me really digging deep into what I'm sharing today as someone who teaches bias interruption for a living and teaches people about how to be more inclusive was a few months back. I went out grocery shopping for one of the first few times that I was actually felt like, okay, you can leave your home, and yes, physical distancing doesn't mean that you can't go grocery shopping. You should go grocery shopping. So my partner and I, my spouse and I, out we go into the world to go to the grocery store. And to say I behaved bizarrely would be an understatement. I was doing one of these like peaks, when someone like literally cross 3 feet into my orbit. I was like, what are you doing? Like, don't you know you should be honoring 6 feet? But more importantly, I was like doing this like bob and weave thing, and then or going like this. Like I was literally startled. And my partner, he said to me, Ritu, what are you doing? Like you're behaving like really bizarrely. And I didn't realize it. I didn't notice it. And by the way, I no longer behave like that. Although when people come really close to me, I do get a bit jumpy. However, it's morphed into my new thing I'm finding that I'm doing when I'm interacting or when people come into my orbit out there in the world is I'm holding my breath. Like when I walk by large groups of people, I literally will hold my breath. And by the way, there is no scientific research out there that substantiates that holding your breath is an effective way to prevent yourself from contracting COVID. But it doesn't matter because I'm like, I know what I will do. I will hold my breath to remain safe. The point is that there is, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. Like I'm sure and by the way,
I do that too. Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah.
Exactly. I'm sure some of you are going, yeah, I'm doing this. And so we have a warranted fear of contracting a virus. But the moment, remember, we feel fear in the body, heightened activation of the nervous system can lead to increased biased behavior because we are engaging in avoidance of others. So the more activated we are, the more likely we are to engage in biased behavior. And I can talk more about that as we continue to evolve in our conversation. The second thing that I think is really important here is that this fear of COVID is happening at the same time where we continue to be strongly encouraged to engage in physical distancing. Now, here is the thing with physical distancing. First of all, it's antithetical to the human body's experience as it relates to our desire to be around other people. As human beings, we deeply, deeply, deeply crave other people's presences, like their physical presences. Even introverts do. Even though there's a mistaken belief that introverts are having a great time right now, it's like, no, as human beings, I'm sure this resonates with you right?
Yes, as an introvert.
Right, exactly. So we deeply crave co-regulation of our nervous systems. So in this moment, when a lot of us actually would benefit from being around other people, we're being told, no, be really safe, be really careful, engage in physical distancing. And in fact, what essentially we're being told to do is tighten and shrink your in-group and push out and expand your out-group. This is essentially the impact of physical distancing. It's the careful who you're around, be really careful, expanding of the out-group, and tighten and shrink your in-group. That's essential, that's bias, that's othering. And so we have the genuine fear activation of the nervous system happening at this time where we're literally counseling and coaching, training our bodies to grow the out-group, shrink the in-group, in the backdrop of discussions that have already framed the COVID environment in racist ways, like calling it a Chinese virus. I've seen a little bit discussed about this, but if we were to dig deeper, the intersectionality of who it is that we think carries COVID and who doesn't. So when we're out in public, let's talk about racial biases. Frontline workers, essential workers, people who work in trade services, there's a lot of Black and brown skinned people in these groups. And when you intersect that with class, coming from lower socioeconomic or working class backgrounds, the perception around who is a carrier of COVID, who then are we growing in the out group, who are we avoiding? All of this is happening at a time when, interestingly enough, there's a spotlight being put on racial justice, injustice, racial inclusion, and we're supposed to be focusing on how to do a better job here in the backdrop of this pandemic and all of that. So this is a really complicated, tricky, challenging, nuanced moment that really warrants us taking pause and thinking about how we, in our social interactions and in our workplace interactions, can ensure that we are addressing the proliferation of bias in a proactive way.
Yeah. In episode 8, again, Michael Thomas talked about how we need to heal from our trauma, how we need to really come to terms with what is happening in our bodies in this moment. So, or we risk doing more harm to others. And I have an executive coach I've worked with a number of years, Susan Gear, who focuses on embodied leadership. And I do think that that's a key here is, when we are leading in this time, we need to be really understanding what's happening in our bodies, not just our minds, and that is a key piece of it, but also what are we holding in our bodies and how to move through that so that we're really embodying inclusion. And it's not easy. It's being embodied and being more resilient is a key piece of that.
100%. I couldn't agree more with what you've just said. I think it's so critical.
How do we do that? What do you do, and how do you kind of work on yourself? And I mean, I also, when I used to go walking about twice a week in the evenings, and then continued that for a while during shelter in place, and kind of stopped doing that because I realized that I was starting to see people as obstacles, as potentially affecting me, dangerous, right? And I do not feel like that is good for me, for anybody. And so I stopped going for those walks, and I do yoga inside instead. Kind of make those connections are, through the screen are still connections. It's not the same. Yeah. But it has made a big difference for me. I have, because I do think that is dangerous. I think that is something we need to work through and be really careful about those thoughts and understand them and see them in ourselves. How do we become, how do we embody inclusion? How do we embody leadership in a different way?
All of what you just said really resonates with me. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to talk a bit about why embodiment is so important. And in fact, why don't I go back a little bit? I want to tell you, in my view, what embodiment is essentially about and why it's so critical to inclusive behavior and inclusive leadership. So when we're talking about embodiment, what we're essentially talking about is being in your body, which I know sounds like some really hippy dippy stuff for a lot of people, especially from a Western, like a Canadian American centric way of being, where we have been really heavily socialized to be analytical beings who are in the left brain, data driven and numbers and metrics and more. And so some of what we're talking about will sound like really soft, squishy, hippy dippy stuff. Ironically, this is exactly what the research says causes us to lead happier, healthier lives and helps us to be more effective as leaders and inclusive leaders. But when we're talking about embodiment, what we're essentially talking about is your ability to track sensation and affect in your body. So it's do you feel the tingling in the left shoulder? Do you feel the heat down your spine? Do you feel the tightness in your chest or navel, solar plex region? Do you feel a tapping in your calf? And it's interesting. So I've studied to be a yoga teacher and a mindfulness teacher. And at present, I'm studying to be a trauma therapist, not because I'm actually going to become a trauma therapist, but because in my work on helping people to heal from racial trauma in particular, it's important that I have an understanding of the body. And so when we look at mindfulness and yoga and we explore the body through that, or even explore the body, exploring our trauma that lives in our body through an embodied way, we start to be able to sense these types of experiences in the body. We're also better able to tune into affect. So I'm feeling happy right now, and I know I'm feeling happy because I feel the tingling in my chest, and I feel the flush of joy pulse through me, or the sadness or the stress or whatever. That's what being embodied is. But being embodied is also about being able to track the thoughts in our minds. So to be able to bring ourselves into present moment, to have present awareness so that we can hear the negative narratives in our minds. So we can hear ourselves saying negative things about ourselves to ourselves, and then work to interrupt that. But being embodied and tracking the voices in the mind also helps us to unearth unconscious biases, pushing them into conscious awareness so that we can hear ourselves, wow, I just saw an Asian person and my brain said coronavirus. Or I just saw a younger Black man wearing a hoodie and my brain said criminal. Like, this is the type of work that we can do by being embodied. And so when we're talking about embodiment, we're talking about literally being in your body, tracking and sensing sensation, feelings, and hearing the thoughts in our minds. And so that's what embodiment is about. And why this is so important is because when we are more embodied, like, everything follows from there. So let's talk again about the nervous system. When we are more embodied, first of all, we have a more resilient and coherent, a calm, settled nervous system. So we're less likely to be triggered into fight, flight, or freeze. So remember earlier when I was saying, when there's lots of threat stimuli in the environment, the body unconsciously is going, oh my goodness, you're in danger, push you into fight, flight, or freeze. When we're more resilient and coherent, we have a settled nervous system because we're embodied. Like, we actually say to our body, you're going to be okay, you're going to be okay. So earlier today, let me give you an example. I literally have been back-to-back Zoom calls. Like, me and Zoom, we're like best friends today, although I'm so annoyed by Zoom. Anywho, like, you're going video call to video call. I'm like, oh, for the love of God, can I not just have a regular phone call? Anywho, I took a break, got some water, went to the ladies' room in my home. And as I'm walking back to my desk, I feel like stress, and I said to myself, take a breath, calm down. You feel the stress in your body, just take a breath. And now actually take several breaths. And then I start doing my deep belly breathing. And I actually said to myself, like, I heard my voice, heard the voice in my head say to myself, you're safe, you're okay, you're stressed, there's a lot going on, just breathe. So we're less likely to push ourselves into that activated state when we have more resilient, calm, settled nervous system. And that ties back to being embodied. Or when we are triggered, we can hear the negative narratives, we can hear the biased thoughts, we can feel that I'm uncomfortable with this person in my body. And when we're triggered, we're better able to say to ourselves, you're okay, you're safe, calm yourself. So being embodied is critical for interrupting negative narratives, in hearing biased behavior, interrupting our biased behavior, engaging in self-coaching, making more healthy, conscious awareness decisions, engaging in self-love, and so much more. It essentially is everything as it relates to being an effective leader. I know I still haven't answered your question on what to do to be embodied, but I thought it was important for me to share those two things, like what is embodiment and why this is important.
Yeah, agreed. And there's and there is that, you know, there's a lot going on for a lot of us right now, and whether, you know, my Black colleagues, my Black family are going through some really deep trauma right now. We also, as an ally, I certainly am taking on, I realized at a certain point last week that I was really taking on and taking in and letting it live within me, the deep-seated racism that I'm seeing, and then my, yeah, and I think all of us have really need to be aware of that. And you know, my meditation teacher, actually she's my acupuncturist that's doing meditation right now, told me that other people's guilt and shame can't live in your heart. And I was like, that really helped me a lot to kind of realize it was living there, and I was taking on the real toxicity of what happens when people are newly awakened often to racism and have questions that can be really toxic. And so anyway, all that is to say that it was that, you know, me taking the time to do that meditation and really hear that and realize that and let that go, that made a huge difference for me. It just lightened, and I was able to then show up so much more and to really be there and create change in a different way.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. You know, so in studying this experience, this journey that I'm having in exploring my own racial trauma by doing this exploring racial trauma, not only from like an academic embodiment experiencing approach, but also living it and feeling it myself. I've had several ahas. Growing up, and up until I'd say a few years ago, I would find myself in situations where someone would talk about a racist experience they had had, or I'd read something, a passage, or I'd see something on news. Like, for example, another unarmed Black man is murdered by the state for doing nothing, and for being Black, and I just felt this tremendous amount, a wave of grief come over me. And I'm sure for a lot of people listening today, this will resonate with you, but just constantly carrying grief in me. Yes. And when I'm sure this resonates.
Yeah.
And when I started to explore it, I would think to myself, okay, but Ritu, you had some racist bullying experiences growing up. And yes, there was the genocide. And, but you were 8 and like you weren't there for it. So why such trauma? Why such grief? Like, what is this about? It didn't feel commensurate with my lived experience. What I now have come to learn, and this is why Michael's podcast was so powerful for me as well, is that trauma lives in our bodies and we inherit it through our genetics. It's called the genetic inheritance of trauma. It's also passed intergenerationally through systems and practices. And so I mentioned earlier that my parents lived through war and exile. My mother was in vitro when her parents were making the decision, were ultimately forced to exile. They abandoned their house, their property, belongings, everything, and left, now Pakistan, then India, to move to Delhi. And she was like a week old when that happened. And I now have learned through my trauma studies that we can pass along our trauma in vitro through the amniotic fluid, but also through the DNA expression, through the sperm and egg. And I think about my mother's experience, what happened with her and what trauma lives in her body by way of my grandmother. And then of course my ancestors, because India was colonized for hundreds of years, how that was passed along. And my father has his own experiences of watching violence, mob violence in India when he was around decolonization around the age of 5, and what got passed along through to him and then through him to me. And so much of this heaviness that I feel in my body, it's not mine. Like, it's not mine as in not of this life. However, it is mine because it belongs to my genetics and my gene, my kin, my ancestors. And so this overwhelming grief that I carry with me that I didn't understand before, it has been so powerful to understand where it is from, why it is here, and more importantly, now that I'm tuned into it, because I am more aware of its existence, I don't judge it. I am with it, and through my embodiment strategies, I'm able to manage and do the healing work that's needed. To help me live better. And so even in these moments where I am calling this moment, we have a racial justice / injustice crisis in the midst of a global pandemic crisis, where I have repeatedly felt grief, tremendous waves of grief. My embodiment strategies have really been helpful to assuage some of the pain that I'm feeling. And so being embodied in the context of today's discussion is really important, because not only can it help you interrupt your own proclivities to engage in biased behavior, so we interrupt, lessen the amount of hate we're putting out there, but also when we're on the receiving end of hate, and it harms us because we hold it in our bodies, as you can see. And we can also use embodiment to help us heal. And by the way, when I say that it comes our way and we hold it in our bodies will perceive, our nervous systems will perceive racist acts, racial biases, micro inequities, aggressions, like you pronounced my name wrong, you mistook me for admin staff. Not that there's anything wrong with admin staff, but I've worked very hard to earn my lot. And so to consistently be in a place where people minimize who I am and what my credentials and my experiences, the nervous system doesn't know the difference between you said my name wrong again and I'm attacked by a bear. The nervous system just knows there's an external threat out there. So our bodies will perceive the fear of bias, actual acts of racism, inequities, as an attack or a potential attack. And this is what, and if this happens enough, if biased behavior, racist behavior, sexist behavior, homophobic behavior, whatever the intolerance ties back to, the prejudice ties back to, enough of it comes our way, we can, and we're pushed into fight or flight or freeze consistently, generating energy in the body that gets trapped and isn't discharged. This is when we start to carry trauma in our bodies. And so racial trauma actually is a real thing. It's the constantly having hate come our way, our body then saying, wow, I'm under attack, generating energy that's not released, gets trapped, turns into trauma, essentially is what happens. So this is actually a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I think that there's a piece of this where when you see someone else going through trauma and you've experienced it yourself and you start to feel it in your own body, and that's part of empathy, right? Is really like deeply understanding and you know, not you know, you obviously I have not gone through my life as a Black person. There's no way I can completely understand it, but I can feel a piece of it. And that is empathy. And really, because I know and understand my body, I sense that. And I think the key is to recognize it and then let your body go through a process where you're healing, so it's not living there, but it is living and embodying. You know, you're embodying change. You're taking action to create change around it.
Yeah.
And I think one more thing comes to mind. I was thinking about this morning. Is I'm seeing a lot of very new people to this that may have just had an aha moment around, oh, wow, racism is a real thing that's happening right now in this moment. I thought it was history, right? And I went through that experience a long time ago, but I remember that experience. And there's an initial fear and resistance that happens when you hear that you have been a part of racism and you have been complicit in that. There's a real fear and often a resistance, and that I think is something that is really important for people new to this to recognize, that if you feel a resistance, that means something is changing, and that means you need to really investigate what that resistance is and why you're having it. The first time I heard the word privilege, I was, what? Wait, what?
Right.
Right? That recognition, well, it wasn't recognition. First, it was resistance, that I've worked hard to get where I am, and I have gone through a lot of barriers myself, and as a woman, I had that initial resistance, and then slowly I kind of came to terms with that and realized, absolutely, I have privilege that other people don't have as a result of this. But that is a process that you need to go within yourself, and that kind of interior process is so critical to allyship, to really leading with empathy and inclusive leadership, and really kind of getting to a point where you should be helping to create change.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting. Something that you just said reminded me of an experience I had. So when COVID first started to impact Canada, Toronto, similar to what the experience was in New York, I was at a drugstore one evening, later in the evening, and it was very quiet. And I walk in and I see two Asian appearing women, and like East Asian in particular. And I looked at them and I was in my head, like, because I'm at the drugstore, got to grab my stuff, got to get home, blah, blah, blah. But I'm in my head, but I hear the word coronavirus go through my head as I'm looking at them. Conscious awareness. So unconsciously, it could be happening unaware, but I looked at them and the word coronavirus came up. So I mentioned earlier, like, Melinda, I teach bias disruption for a living, right? Like as I stand in front of people and I say, here's what unconscious bias is and what conscious biases are, and here's what you need to do to interrupt them, and blah, blah, blah. And I have this moment and I'm like, OMG, like, racist, everyone. And it was almost like I'm like, could they hear my thoughts? Like, I'm mortified in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I went home. And of course, because I do this work, I know how the brain works. And I know what, at the time, we were being bombarded by images of coronavirus being a Chinese virus. It hadn't really hit Canada or the US at that stage. And so it wasn't surprising that in my brain, unconsciously, and then the conscious awareness piece, I'm going to come back to that, my brain was holding coronavirus connected to an Asian person. This is what bias is. And this is why what we intake from media, social media, literature, arts, who we interact with is so important, because it either reinforces biases or helps to dismantle and disrupt. So I often will say, like on Instagram, for example, I put up a lot of quotes, and I have a quote that says, what we consume matters. And this is a really good example of what we consume matters. And so I came home, and this was a moment for me to engage in self-compassion and empathy around how I'm a human being too, that everyone engages in biases. The important piece here is for me to figure out, where did this come from? Why was I holding this belief? And most importantly, what am I going to do to dismantle it? Mm-hmm. So compassion and empathy, it really is important that it starts with ourselves, so that we're better positioned to exercise it in our interactions with others. Like, as we know from Psychology 101, how we treat the self is how we will treat others. And I think for a lot of us, we don't give ourselves permission to even explore what our biases are, because we worry that if I actually go there and start to reveal the darkness that I hold within my mind and my body around other people, well, that will affirm that I'm a racist. And so it's just easier to say, I'm not racist. I'm anti-racist. I'm not racist, than it is to say, actually, every single human being, people of color included, Indigenous people included, we hold racial biases because this is how white supremacy and racism permeate our societies, and that we internalize the biases even as people of color and Indigenous peoples. And so it's important for us to understand, okay, I'm human and this has happened and I get it, but now what am I going to do about it? And so I think this is it's a really important process of exploration, that rather than fearing what we hold, that we approach it, and we approach it with love and empathy and compassion for ourselves as well. And then the last thing I'll say here, because it connects and goes back to the racial trauma piece. I mentioned earlier about my story growing up feeling really confused and not experiencing belonging. The piece I didn't mention then, but I'll mention now, is I also grew up really self-loathing and experiencing a lot of lack of self-love. That makes me emotional when I share, it makes me emotional because I'm like, Ritu, you've come so far. You've done such a good job of healing, because the way I love myself now, I never would have envisaged myself loving myself like that before. The reason I didn't love myself as much back then is because I consistently had racism and negative messaging coming my way from my peer group. I struggled in my own cultural community with identity and belonging. We come to hold these negative messages and we feel like we are less worthy. And even moving towards exploring the self and understanding the darkness that we hold in ourselves about ourselves can be really difficult as well, and scary to do. But this is the beauty of doing this healing work, that when we do this healing work around being embodied, for example, and I'm happy to share what do I mean, what do I do to be embodied, because there's a truckload of stuff. It takes a village to be embodied, everyone. And that I'm living my best life. And the last thing I'll say here is, in doing my own self-healing work, not only do I feel better connected to myself and I feel better about who I am, but I would say it has helped me to create far more meaningful, enriching relationships. I'm a better partner, lover. I'm a better daughter, sister, friend, leader. And I think my ability to lead, even including in this COVID moment when half the time I'm the worst leader ever. And I'm so stressed all the time, and my poor team and all of that, constantly worrying about them because it's such a stressful moment. I still think that because I lead with authenticity and vulnerability and courage and empathy, that even those moments when I am a shitty leader, because I am at times, I think I get empathy back, because it literally transforms who you are.
And what do you do? What do you do? How do you become more embodied? What are some of the things that you do?
Yeah. So, it's so interesting, Melinda, I'm sure you can relate to this as well. And I'm sure that so many of the people listening in today can. I didn't even know that I was doing some of these things. I didn't realize that, wow, I'm doing this. For example, my obsession with dancing. I love to dance. I say that I love to dance would be an epic understatement. Pre-COVID, even though I'm turning 45, I constantly am at nightclubs. I'm a huge soca fan, so I go to soca fets. I go to Bhangra jams, which is Punjabi dance music. I'm there, and I will be the 65-year-old at the nightclub dancing. Why? Because I love music. I love to dance. And now what I realize is, through again my trauma studies, that dancing is a really good way. First of all, the drum, the vibration helps to shake out the energy, but dancing literally helps us to shake energy out of the body. I did not know this. I did not realize, for example, that listening to music helps to send vibrations to the body that unearths the trapped energy and pushes the energy out. That a lot of the things I was naturally gravitating towards have been really helpful. So I now am increasingly mindful about all of the things that I'm doing through the day, and at the end of the day, to be in a more embodied state. One of the most powerful things that I do, and I'm concentrated on this, and I've already mentioned this, and I talk a lot about this on across social media and more, is I focus on breathing properly. And I know this will resonate with you. The reason I'm all about the breath is not just because like yoga is about the breath and I'm brown and brown people invented yoga and that's why I'm spewing out the breath. It's that the breath is so powerful because here's the thing. We all have to do it anyways. You're doing it all day long. It's free. Most of us are doing it wrong. If we were to just do it right, it can tremendously alter our experience. And in particular, what I'm talking about is focusing on diaphragm breathing or belly breathing and taking increasingly slow inhalations and then deep exhalations and pushing stale air from the bottom of our lungs in and out, helps to relax the nervous system, helps to push out toxins, bring down the heart rate, so much more. To remind myself to breathe, not only do I have scented oils, like literally sitting at my desk back there, and I literally cover my face with lavender throughout the course of the day because it smells nice, but it also reminds me to breathe. I keep a heating pad on my chair up against my back, and it, first of all, reminds me to sit up straighter so that I can engage in better diaphragm belly breathing. Every time I say like breathe well, people like, do what we're both doing. It's like, oh, my posture, everyone.
Yeah.
Vertebrae right on top of each other. Like, get those chakras in alignment. So it helps me to sit up straight. Also, it's against my back, right by the kidneys. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. The cortisol release. It's like, no, you're safe, adrenal glands. You're safe, kidney. No need for that extra surge in cortisol. You're going to be okay. By the way, these are simple things that I'm not adding on to the end of the day. They're integrated into my as I work. And so being embodied isn't just something we do at the end of the night where we're like, okay, now I must do 35 minutes of yoga and then I will be an embodied human being. It's like, no. Or like, for example, I'm very into, if you follow me on Instagram, you'll know that I'm constantly posting stories about my self-care tools. Like you name the massage tool, like whether it be a lacrosse ball, I got a neck massager, I got hand massagers. I'm constantly like giving myself massages where I feel tension in the body. I will release the tension by using massage. As a way to get the energy and toxins out. And so there are myriad things that we can be doing. You mentioned you used to go for a walk, but now you're practicing yoga. Perfect. The point is to ensure, for some people it's cooking, other people it's painting, some people it's snuggling with their fur babies or their actual babies or whatever, listening to music, drawing, taking a bath, actually meditating in that traditional classic way that the yogis used to do 6,000 years ago. It could just be simply sitting on your sofa and just breathing. Like anything that can bring us into the moment can fall into an embodiment strategy.
Yeah. And Shamika asks, how do we best release those emotions if we can't recognize them in the moment? And I think there's another piece of that, and not only recognizing them in a moment, but having the space to deal with them in the moment. We don't always have that time. And Michael talked about that a little bit in episode 8 also, that you know, you just need to deal with it soon, right? As soon as you recognize it, if you can, work on it in the moment, or you also spend time afterwards.
Yeah. You know, I love that question. One of the, I had this, the week that George Floyd was murdered, as you may recall, was an extremely intense emotional week. I mean, it continues to be, but that week in particular stands out to me as someone of color. So I say this as a brown girl. I can't even imagine what it is like to experience white supremacy and anti-Black racism as a Black person. But in that week, I, as a person of color, felt my racial trauma activated. I also do equity, diversity, inclusion work for a living. And so it was challenging from that perspective. There was so much going on for me. What I found that week is that I couldn't feel. In fact, it reminded me of being back in early March when COVID first hit Toronto and Canada and the US, and suddenly travel stopped, remote working, physical distancing all hit at once. For those first few weeks, I couldn't feel anything. that I could tell that my body was in freeze. My nervous system was engaging in a freeze response. It's a coping strategy. We numb, we disassociate as a way to navigate through this difficult time. And in that moment, I knew I was off. Like I knew something was awry with me. And my main objective during that time was to breathe, to just keep breathing, because for me, it is the experience that helps probably the most. And then also just to track whatever sensation I could in my body. And so it could just be noticing, wow, I'm feeling nothing. Like I actually am feeling nothing. Okay, well, where are you feeling the nothingness? What's the nothingness feel like in the chest compared to the nothingness we feel like in our thigh and our knee? And then what I started to notice is I could feel like twitching, like I would feel twitching here and there. And then I would just be with the twitching. And, I know this sounds like hippy dippy shit, but alas, this is exactly what the research says. And the work that we need to do is to be with the twitching, explore the twitching, sense the twitching, not judge the twitching. And it's exactly the type of exploration of the body that helps us bring ourselves into the body in a non-judgmental way, that helps us to live in a more embodied state, so that our nervous systems can feel more safe and settled, so that not only am I healing my own trauma, I'm interrupting my negative narratives, but I'm also doing a better job of clocking my body's activation around, I fear you and I fear other human beings, and therefore I'm going to engage in biased behavior. Like this is exactly the kind of thing that we need to do.
Yeah. We're almost out of time. We have 3 great questions. We're not going to get to all 3, but Linda and Memory both have questions around what to do in the workplace. So we literally only have a couple minutes, but Memory asks, unconscious bias due to othering is tricky, but important, obviously. And how do you broach the topic with colleagues without making them feel attacked, alienated, and causing that fight or flight in them in the process? And then Linda asks, any tips to address the dismissal of the touchy-feely hippie stuff, and when you're trying to work on this in the workplace?
Yeah. I think this COVID moment is a brilliant opportunity for us to dramatically interrupt organizational culture that has not been working for us and has been holding us back. And I'm finding that in discussions around effective leadership, inclusive leadership, wellness and well-being, addressing mental health challenges, and so much more, this is the opportunity for us to lead with authenticity and sharing as leaders. Like leaders go first. How I behave will then cascade down and impact how my team will respond in kind. And so, and for all leaders, this is the case. And so if as a leader, you lead with courage, vulnerability, authenticity, compassion, empathy in communicating your own struggles with maintaining wellness in this moment, what you're doing to be more embodied, the value of being embodied, the value of creating a more resilient nervous system to interrupt fear and othering and heal racial trauma, the more you talk about it, the more others will do the same. And by the way, this is all about trust, building trust and consistency in how we interact with each other. And so we do it again and again. The last thing I'll mention is I have extensive resources, all for free, available at ritubhasin.com. My first name, last name.com. Bias tip sheets, how to be embodied, how to heal, lots of video. The other thing that I wanted to mention is I also post a lot on Instagram on empowerment, and so you can follow me there. The book that changed my life around healing my racial trauma is called My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menachem. And so if you're interested in learning more about how to heal your racial trauma, I recommend that book. But if you DM me on Instagram or on LinkedIn, if you have any questions, I'm also happy to give you additional resources.
Awesome. Ritu, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure always to connect with you on a social level, personal level, professional level. Thank you.
Yeah. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Allyship is a journey, right? We're all on this journey. Nobody has all the answers. And I will say that it's sometimes easier to focus on correcting racism, sexism, ableism externally, but it's really important to do this deep internal work. That is a key piece of that. And that means getting really uncomfortable. That means getting to know yourself, learning and growing, and then take action. Take action, obviously. And the world doesn't change if you don't take action, right? In your lives, in your workplace, and the way you approach everything you do. So start small if you need to, but do something, and then continue to build those actions over time along this journey. Thank you all for joining us today, and join us each week for Leading with Empathy and Allyship. You can sign up to attend with live audience Q&A or catch the podcast or video, and you can stay in the loop by going to changecatalyst.co, changecatalyst.co, and signing up for our newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and our YouTube channel, and we'll see you next time.